And just a few selections within this chapter we'll consider, beginning to read at verse 1, Mark chapter 5. They went out across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been chained hand and foot. But he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" Beginning to read at verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she'll be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman who was there, who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she got worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. We'll conclude there. I'll expound upon this passage a little more than what I read this morning, but at this time we'll again invite the worship team up.
Fred, I just have really quick announcement. It's Vacation Bible School on Friday, 7 o'clock. Take it.
Thank you, Judith. That's right. Okay, so we're having a kids meeting this Friday. Amen. Thank you, worship team. And great singing is the result of great leading. So thank you, worship team, for leading us to the throne of grace with those praises to the Lord. All right. Matthew West, Christian artist, sings a song called "Grace Wins." You see, as I read Mark chapter 5 this past week, meditated upon it, wanted to study it out, to present this chapter to you folks here this morning. And as I kept reading it and listening to that song by Matthew West, I kind of connected the two together. That song just seemed to resonate with me in a way and manner that it hadn't before. I just kept listening to it over and over again. And I just made the connection between Mark chapter 5 and understanding if there was a title at the beginning of Mark chapter 5 that I was to put down, would be "Grace Wins." Grace wins. It's a chapter of pain and suffering and sorrow, and we'll get into that and look at the individuals who are going through these struggles. And it would finish that way if Jesus Christ did not enter into the bleakness of these people's existence at that time. And these miracles took place in this passage of Scripture as they're recorded, that each miracle that Jesus accomplishes on the individuals seems to, it almost defines, describes, elaborates upon grace and the definition of grace. In other words, as we look at grace, if we were to define grace with words, Jesus described it in works here. You know, really, grace doesn't mean a lot in words if it doesn't mean anything to us personally. It is meant to be something that's not only defined, but something that is experienced. So the author of grace and its recipients, we read about here, the bestower and the beneficiaries of grace. In other words, this chapter, and I think we sang that in one of the songs though, is like shining a brilliant light on a jet black canvas. Remember that Jesus had already said what? As we considered in previous chapters, in Mark chapter 2, that what? It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but it is the sick. Jesus did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So if I was to write this chapter on profiles of grace, this may be it. Though the Bible is filled with grace and passages of grace specifically, but this chapter really is a profile of grace. So I want to talk a little bit about a profile of grace. I want to give definitions of grace and elaborate upon the definition of grace, build upon it as we study these miracles that were wrought and how people were blessed by them. First of all, in reading this, I see that grace has direction. Grace in its direction. The direction of grace. Who is it directed toward? If I was to ask you to give a word definition, what would you say the definition of grace is? In a sentence or two. It is perhaps unmerited favor. We've heard that one before plenty of times. Where it's God bestowing on someone something that they don't deserve. And that is a good definition of grace. And as we think of it, and we can build upon grace, it's described in many different ways. In Acts, we're talking about, in Corinthians, the grace of giving, as we talked about this past week in studying 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So there's many different angles and facets to grace. But in its broadest definition, it's unmerited favor. It has direction. Unmerited favor toward whom, may we ask? Well, there are three individuals that it's directed toward in this chapter. It's directed toward the demonic, the diseased, and the dead. As we think of this, this chapter, we see that Jesus, we notice about Jesus, and sometimes I'll use that word interchangeably. I'll say Jesus, and then I'll say grace. I'm speaking about the same person. You see, because even in John chapter 1, John writing about the description of Jesus, it says we beheld him. He was full of grace and truth. Referring to Jesus in John chapter 1. So when I use the term grace, I'm speaking about Jesus oftentimes. The bestower. And the first thing we notice about grace in this chapter is that what? It meets humanity and people where they're at. It comes down to minister to people. It says, we read what? In the first verse. They went across the lake. They went across the lake. Jesus had direction and purpose to where he was going. There is the direction of grace. You know, if you're a Trekkie here, you know the theme song, Space, the Final Frontier. And what goes on in that song? To boldly go where no man has gone before. You see, Jesus boldly goes where no man would even tread. That's the direction of grace. And we see this in the first example cited. When we read of the demonic in the first few verses that I read, in the scripture reading time, there was a demonic, and Jesus went right there. It talks about the demonic. He lived in tombs. What does it say? No one could bind him, in verse 3. What does it say in verse 4? No one was strong enough to subdue him. Jesus goes where no other man can go to minister grace. Look at the diseased. It's almost as if this was meant to be two miracles in this chapter. But lo and behold, this woman stepped in, interrupted Jairus' urgent need, and she had a need herself. And it was the diseased here of the woman, and it talks about her sickness. It may have been hemophilia, or it may have been a female issue. The Bible does not disclose that information, but usually we assume that it's a female issue. But the woman who had suffered much due to a condition which caused her to bleed for 12 years. It says even though many doctors had attempted to help her, it was to no effect, no avail. They could not heal her. Jesus goes where no man can help. In verse 26. Even though she'd even spent all of her money with all of the get-well programs and all of the get-well people, they could not take care of her situation. Jesus went there. And for sure the last one, no one can do a thing about it. Remember, Jairus came to see Jesus at the beginning of, in verse 21, it talks about that as Jesus is continuing on his way. He crossed over the Sea of Galilee again to another point, and there's Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders. He says, my daughter is very sick. She's dying. And in the intervening time, this woman who expressed her concern and her condition and was healed. And then by the time Jesus got to visit with Jairus, the little girl had died. There was no one there to help this little girl from dying. Again, we need to be reminded that's what Jesus is concerned about. The demonic, the diseased, and the dead. And may I suggest that all of humanity falls into these categories. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son. So, the first observation I make is that humanity is frail. You see, I'm doing an overview of this chapter. I've heard messages preached on the specific miracles recorded in this, but I've never heard them put together. And so that's what I'm attempting to do. So lo and behold, I hope you brought your lunchbox with you. Because this is going to be a longie. Okay. Now the first observation I want to make in general about this chapter and about the individuals who were sick, who were diseased, who were demonic, who died, is that we recognize that in each case, the individuals are completely what? Lost without hope. No one can help them, whether it's friends, whether it's physicians, or whether it's family. And that's a snapshot and a description of humanity without God, without help, without hope, separated from God, lost in sin, and without Christ. And that's where grace does what? Unmerited favor of God intervenes into humanity. Grace enters into the darkness. Observation number 2 on this chapter as we read through it. In each case, this is not the usual experience of these ones. I'm sure when the respective mothers were holding these little babies, whether it was the demonic, whether it was the disease, or whether it was the dead, when the mother was holding these little children in their arms, when these mothers were holding these children in their arms, they weren't thinking, my child's going to be a demonic. this child is going to have severe sickness problems, and this child is going to die at a young age. That was not in the planning. The observation is not only is life frail and fragile and imperfect, life is unpredictable. Things oftentimes don't turn out the way we want them to or plan on having them. But may I suggest, in our disappointment, God's grace can make an appointment as He enters into our problems and pain. Grace intersects with our sorrow and suffering. And if it isn't for grace in this chapter, boy, we wouldn't be here. This would be a depressing chapter to read. In fact, it is. It is unless somebody can in some way identify with these individuals. And as I said, sometimes when we read this, we think, phew, I'm glad that's not me. Well, sooner or later, in some way, shape, or form, it's going to be us. Maybe not the specific one, the demonic, but we're all chained to something anyways. And we're all going to get sick sooner or later, and we're all going to leave this earth sooner or later. You see, grace, in the direction of grace, that's what God is looking at. Jesus goes over on the boat, and He goes right in to issues, struggles. The storm that He went through is more or less preparing the disciples for the storms of life that they're going to encounter here in this chapter and 5. But may I suggest also that grace has demands. The demands of grace. As we read about these 3 miracles, we notice how people responded. Each one of them said something. Well, each one of them did something. First, look at verse 6 of chapter 5. Look what the demonic did. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. Look at Jairus, the father of the girl, in verse 22. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came and went, and he saw Jesus. He fell at his feet. And as well as we consider the woman who was suffering with sickness for 12 years, in verse 25. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Well, that's not what I'm looking at.
27.
Thank you. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. No, that's not what I'm looking at here. Come on, people. 33. All right. Thank you. I was just testing you. Okay. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. All of them have the same reaction when they encounter Jesus. They fell at their feet. They fell on their knees. There's something about grace that needs to be understood, is it has demands. It has the author of grace. There's only one author of grace, and it's none other than God Himself. Even the demonic, even the demon speaking through the demon-possessed man says what? He fell on his knees in verse 6 in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" And that would be a term reserved for Gentiles in referring to the God of Israel, who was the supreme God, as Nebuchadnezzar did in Daniel chapter 3. The Most High God. He is the God above all gods. The superior, ultimate God. And of course, all the other gods are simply idols. There's a recognition that grace, to be a recipient of grace, you have to know that grace is from God and who God is. That's where you're looking for grace to experience it. You can't look for it anywhere else. Ultimate grace and salvation and sanctification. There's the demands of grace. Interesting to note in that passage, even the demons knew who Jesus was, whereas the Pharisees did not. You see, a hardened heart of the Pharisees, their calloused heart, they wouldn't even recognize, acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of the Most High God, whereas these demons do. These demons were not doing it to worship Jesus. We can understand that and appreciate that. But Jesus was capable to cast out these demons into the swine because of his authority over all the powers, his ultimate, absolute authority. You see, people today seek to discover grace through all kinds of self-help, to be delivered from what is oppressing, yet without victory, because deliverance is found alone in the name and power of Jesus Christ. And one cannot waver in acknowledging and believing the authority of Jesus for there to be deliverance, especially from the domain of darkness and the forgiveness of sins and redemption. And so we see that in this first example, grace, there are demands on grace. It's not just, oh boy, I'm a child of God because I'm born into the world. There has to be a recognition of who Jesus is, that even the demons, to their own demise, but nonetheless, they recognized who Jesus was from a far way off, and they saw him coming. And Jesus knew he would be to the deliverance of the man who the demons were possessing. It demands truth as well, does grace. If you want to be the recipient of grace, it demands truth. It's not your truth, it's the truth. So what happens here in the case of this woman? She reaches out and she's thinking to herself, if I can only touch Jesus, touch his clothing, he will heal me and I'll be healed from my sickness. And sure enough, she's healed. But Jesus doesn't leave it there, does he? He says, who touched me? Somebody touched me. And the disciples are saying, how do you know somebody touched you all with all these people pressing against you? And Jesus says, who touched me? Why did he say that? To embarrass this poor woman? I don't think so. Look at verse 32. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what happened to her, came, fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, I've been there, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. You see, grace demands the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If you want to experience true grace, you need to truly be honest before God of who you are. And you see, she had been healed physically, but Jesus wants more than that. There are many people, remember the Bible says that God blesses the unrighteous and even the wicked with rain and sun as well as the righteous. Except the righteous are willing to say thank you. And the physical healing isn't what Jesus was primarily concerned with here. He was concerned with the spiritual healing. And for her to really know who God is, she needed to say the whole truth rather than kind of trying to skirt around the truth and just, I just want to be blessed by touching you, and that's good enough for me. Jesus said, Jesus says, who touched me? My question for you is, are you being honest to God? Remember David said, to you only have I sinned, you alone. Even though he had affected other people's lives and hurt other people, David acknowledged that first and foremost, sin is against God. Disobedience is against God. And this woman, she told the whole truth. And then she received a wonderful blessing and promise from God. But we see that when it comes to the demands of grace, there needs to be a recognition of Jesus as the authority. Jesus is the truth. And as well, as we continue along this train of thought, Jesus, it demands faith. I think in one of the songs that we sang, it was about belief. We're going to show that movie, Do You Believe? Grace demands faith. You see, the daughter, as we continue along with the third miracle, the daughter of Jairus was dying in verse 23, and during the interrupted meeting with the woman, what happened? His daughter died. Tragic, sad, and painful. However, Jesus said, don't be afraid in verse 36, but what? Believe. Don't be afraid. Just believe. Many didn't, as we continue to read on. But what grace demands, in order to be a recipient of God's grace, is to believe. To believe in what God is offering as He reaches His hand out, an offer of grace. It needs to be believed, what He's offering. The offer that God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him. Or how about living by faith? I need to believe that it's true. I don't want to waver between belief and unbelief. Jesus emphasized that point. And this is the principle that Christ's teaching in this situation, that grace requires believing. Believing in Him. That He has the power to raise the dead to life. Sometimes I wonder how many Christians actually believe that. Because if we did, of course death in itself is even sad and sorrowful, but we don't have sadness and sorrow as the world does, because we believe that once we leave this earth, we enter the presence of God, where there's uninterrupted joy. Do you believe that? So we see that grace has demands as well. As we talk about grace has direction. But grace also, there is also the documentation of grace in this chapter. Really, I'm using this chapter to help us define grace. I read it in this, even though the word is not used. Just like you won't read Trinity in the Bible. But you know that by reading the Bible, there are three persons in the Godhead. And so we don't read grace in every chapter, in every verse, but I read it here. The documentation of grace. There's a testimony. If you know the direction of God's grace, if you submitted to the demands of grace in your own life, what does that mean? It means there's a testimony. There's a documentation of grace. How is grace best documented? We read about it so often. But how is it best documented? By the spoken word. By the spoken word of the recipients of grace. Jesus said to the demon-possessed man, look at verse 19. Once he was delivered, and because the demon-possessed man, he was so overjoyed and thrilled that God had delivered him from from being possessed and made him a new creation, that he wanted to just cling to Jesus. And Jesus says, no, don't do that. Look at verse 19. Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how He has had mercy on you. He was exhorted to go back and to be a literal, living testimony of God's grace, and every believer should be able to give a testimony of God's grace and what it's done for them. Perhaps not as not as impressive or dramatic as being, a demon-possessed individual being freed from that. Even though there were many times when I was younger, my mom must have thought I was demon-possessed. But that's another issue altogether. But nonetheless, we've all been delivered. And that's the honest truth. From bondage to our past. We should be able to have a testimony. Has God delivered me, and from what? And he says, what Jesus says to the delivered man, and how he has had mercy on you. That's another definition. That's broadening the definition of grace, isn't it? Grace is giving to us grace is giving to us something that we don't deserve. And mercy is not giving us something that we do deserve. And we see here that there was a testimony of a changed life to go along with just the academic, who God is, and the academic, I'm being honest and truthful to God. There's the experience. God has changed my life. There's a testimony in here. It's all about grace. And how about the woman delivered from the bleeding, from the flow of bleeding? Look at verse 34. Again, what's the testimony? What words of exhortation does Jesus give to her? Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. You see, when Jesus changes your life, there is a change in the way we think, in what we experience, that we have a peace of God that we didn't have before, that we're delivered from suffering that we didn't have before. Once she came clean to God and she spoke the truth, Jesus gave those words to her. You know, there's sometimes things that we hold on to, and that's what's keeping us from having the peace of God in our lives as Christians. To be completely honest, to be open, and to be freed. To go in peace. This morning I want to ask you, do you have the peace of God in your life? I know you may have struggles. I know you may have issues. We all do. That's part and parcel of the human experience in these physical, mortal, temporal bodies. But yet we can still enjoy and appreciate and experience the peace of God. And as well, finally, look at the girl brought back to life. The command, and this is the one that kind of like, I just can't continue along the same theme. Because here Jesus says, be quiet. She's Jairus' daughter. Jesus actually heals her. But this time, look at the words are. Jesus tells her, he gave them in verse 33, the last statement, he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. And he told them to give her something to eat. Why would he do that? You know, Jesus, come on! We want to tell whatever you've done. There was still even a purpose for this that we need to recognize, that Jesus did not want the miracle to attract people to him for the wrong reasons. See, this is the ultimate healing, is bringing back a dead person to life. And if all of a sudden, all these people hear about this healing, then they'll follow Jesus like the ones who were following Jesus just for the physical bread. It would be the same thing over again. They would be following Jesus just for what Jesus can give me. I hate to belabor the subject from oftentimes from month to month, but it flies in the face of the prosperity preachers about health and wealth. Jesus didn't want that. You know, that your life's going to be all good and everything's going to be hunky-dory and you're going to have all you need all the time. And that would have been the issue if this woman, this girl, and the family promoted what Jesus had done. What Christ desires is not what we are on the outside, but what we are on the inside. And that's why Jesus says, give her something to eat. Because you know what? We do pray for the sick to be healthy and to be made well. Don't, you know, I'm not uncompassionate, and we praise God when someone is healed. And there is that physical healing, but we also recognize that sooner or later we're going to get sick again. And we'll pray for healing again, but sooner or later we're going to get sick again. Jesus came to deliver us from death in the sense, not that we're not going to die here on earth physically, but eternal separation from Him and to have the hope of heaven. And so this chapter ends on grace as it began. Jesus wants to emphasize the grace of God. And yes, there are the detractors of grace. For so many people mention God's grace as nothing more than a joke, an anathema. It's the attitude, I don't need God. And that was evident in this passage as well. Not everybody's going to embrace grace. Even though Jesus did so much in this chapter, it was grace on display. What do we read about? About those who responded to Jesus, who had delivered the demonic. What did they say? Go. Get away. Instead of saying, you come here, tell us all about what you've done. Look what you did to that poor man who was demon-possessed. And it really shows us what demons are all about. These demons were making this man just cut himself. The demonic world is anti-God, and they're anti-God's image. And who was created in the image of God? Man. And therefore, that's all demons want to do, is destroy that God has created. But they couldn't, because grace intervened. But even after all that, they simply said, no, look at verse 17. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. That's a sad commentary on these people. It's never recorded that Jesus went back there in the Bible. Look at verse 31. You see, for the woman, so many people didn't know what she was going through. Look in verse 31. You see the people crowding against you? His disciples answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? Jesus knows who's hurting. But for so many, they didn't know. They didn't know that this woman had a serious sickness. Probably they couldn't care less either. Though I'm reading into it by making that statement, but they definitely didn't know. You see, Jesus knows your hurts when many others don't. Jesus can read your mind, and He knows the hurts of your heart. And we also see that look at what happened when Jesus was going to heal this little girl whom Jesus said, oh no, she's not dead, she's asleep. What did they do in verse 40? They laughed at Him. Sometimes people just laugh at grace. Laugh at God. He can't do that. He can't do it for you. He can't do it for me. Yes, He can. And He did. So this is a message of grace. This is a chapter of grace. And I hope that this grace is true in your life. If you have not been the recipient of God's grace, I would say call out to God. Call out to Jesus. Be open and honest to Him. Recognize that He is the way, the truth, and the life. No man can come to the Father but through Him. And trust in Him. Believe in Him for what He did for you by dying on the cross and bearing your sins in His own body. But He rose from the grave. Victory is over death and sin. And also for the believers today, listen, we can sometimes be discouraged. What does God's grace mean to you? Really? Are you experiencing the peace of God and the power of God in your life today? Or are you just going through the motions another day? I know that I shared a word of testimony yesterday at the men's breakfast that I had that attitude even this past week, and I blew it. But you know, God worked in me, God convicted me, God restored me, and that's the way it works with grace. And so maybe you're in that boat as well. Enjoy God's grace this week. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we give thanks to You. Thank You for Your goodness. Thank You for Your grace. Lord, not only may we know Your word and know what grace says, but may we experience it in our lives. So I pray for each one here, Lord, that even as we leave this place of worship, may You make us mindful of Your grace. Each and every day this week. Each and every moment. And Lord, even when it's most difficult and we're going through tough times, may your grace intervene in our lives. We thank you that you care for us and you love us. In Jesus' name I pray.